Hey class, sorry this came out a day later than I told you it would. I'm having some massive slow internet problems. But here the video is. We are on the book of Hebrews. You guys did all your homework on this last week. So this is just a time to take in, get your notes down, and then prepare for the quiz, which will be next week. Since this is coming on a day later, I will provide the quiz for you, not on Monday, but you will take it next uh, Tuesday. So just be prepared for that. All right, so let's get started. We are on the book of Hebrews. We are on, so if you look on page 2, our outline, we're going to hit, as usual, the nuts and bolts, just the basic background, who wrote it, why was it written, what is it about generally, and then we'll look at unique elements, main themes, and end with a few major life implications. So let's get started. All right. Mark Powell, at the very top of page 3, he says this: Christian doctrine and theology owes much to this letter. It is invariably described as a masterpiece. Little background on Hebrews for myself. When I first became a Christian in high school, I remember sitting down at the pier in San Clemente, opening my Bible to the next book that I haven't yet read, which was the book of Hebrews. And I remember they're sitting there at the pier watching the sun go down, and I sat there for hours just reading chapter after chapter of this book, and it completely rocked my world because of what it offers. And so I hope that as you read it, it had a similar effect on you. Hebrews has been my favorite book of the Bible. It's between Hebrews and Colossians, and for the reasons that we'll be talking about. So, as Mark Powell says, Christian doctrine and theology owe much to this letter. So does Mr. Dill. So let's talk about the nuts and bolts. Number one, who wrote it? As you read it, it is actually officially anonymous. That's A1 right there, 1A1. It is officially anonymous. There is no author that is stated. In a lot of the letters that we have in the New Testament, as you've seen from Paul's letters, he states his name at the very beginning. Hebrews is very different. It is kind of like a letter. It's more like a written sermon, like we will see in a second, but it doesn't state the author. However, as you read it, the author seems somewhat familiar with those that he's writing to, and he knows the apostles and things like that. So it's officially anonymous. Number two, though, there's some possible authors that have been offered throughout Christian history, people who various Christians have thought wrote Hebrews for various reasons. We won't go into the reasons for each, but here are 5 of the main contenders that people have thought authored Hebrews. Number 1 is Paul. Paul, which would make sense. Paul wrote over 2/3 of the New Testament, and so him writing Hebrews would not be too far of a stretch, at least him being a possible author to choose from. Second is Apollos. If you remember from Corinthians, Apollos, and from Acts, Apollos was known in the early church to be an excellent preacher, excellent with his words, eloquent in speech, knowing the Old Testament scriptures. The author of Hebrews is very eloquent in his speech. He speaks with the highest level of Greek language in writing. You can tell he's an educated man, but also you could tell he's a good speaker. So some people, like Martin Luther, the great reformer, thought Apollos would be a great contender. Another one is Barnabas. Barnabas was Paul's co-missionary companion. He was a well-known established leader in the church. He would be well known by the church. Barnabas was a Levite from the Levitical family, and so Hebrews deals a lot with Levitical priesthood of the Old Testament priests. So given his background and his status in the church, some people thought Barnabas could have written it. Number 4, Clement is an early church father. Some people think he wrote it. And then 5th, Luke. Even some people think the Apostle Luke, or not the Apostle Luke, sorry, Luke, the writer of Luke's Gospel and Acts, wrote it. So those are 5 possible authors for our class. We're not going to choose one of them. I'm just going to say I have no idea. It's not said in the Bible, and so anything from there is speculation. So those are possible authors. Number 3, though, what we can know. What can we know about the author from Hebrews? Number 1, we know that he was a he. Okay, so when I said we don't know who wrote it, he could have been anyone. Some of you may have been like, well, what if it's a lady? Well, Hebrews 11:32 takes away the the fact that it could be a lady. We read it here. What more shall we say? What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, of Samuel, and the prophets. The I and the me in there in the Greek is in the masculine, so the author was a man. Sorry, ladies. So he was a he. He knew his recipients well, is number two. He knew his recipients well. You can see in Hebrews 13:19, he talks about being restored to them sooner. So he knew his recipients. He wasn't just writing a general letter, a public letter, an open letter. He was writing a letter to people that he, at least a portion of them, he knew. Number three, this guy was friends with Timothy. Timothy, a co-missionary with Paul, leader in the early church. Hebrews 13:23 says, you should know that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes soon. So this guy actually traveled around with Timothy, was on Timothy's missionary team, ministry team, so he's friends with Timothy. Number four, he was highly educated. Read that, pause the video real quick, read that paragraph from Mark Powell in your notes, and you'll see how we know he was highly educated. From this paragraph that you just read, because you paused the video, I know you did, we see at least three things. Number one, the writer of Hebrews, he writes in excellent Greek. He has excellent Greek. You know when you're reading something from someone who's educated, they usually use good vocabulary, they use good grammar, they have a very eloquent way of articulating themselves. That is all true of the Greek language that the author of Hebrews uses. Number two, B, he argues with excellent Greek rhetoric. So not only does he have excellent Greek speaking skills, or at least language, high vocabulary, things like that, he actually knows how to put together a good argument. And so he adopts a lot of the rhetorical, the speaking practices of first century Greek speakers. And so he was a good speaker as well. C, he reveals an excellent knowledge of the Old Testament. He reveals an excellent knowledge of the Old Testament. He, as you have read, both in Dever and from reading Hebrews, the Old Testament is quoted extensively and in depth. And so he had a good knowledge of the Old Testament. Number five, and final about this author, he was probably not an apostle. Again, an apostle is those who are authorized and anointed by Jesus to be his official spokesman, representatives. Apostles are the ones that wrote the majority of the New Testament, or the New Testament was written from the apostles' teachings. This guy is in a league with probably Luke and Mark, who are not apostles, but they wrote according to the message of the apostles. How do we know he wasn't an apostle? Hebrews 2:3 says, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? This salvation was first declared by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. So the author of Hebrews puts himself in a category of people that didn't hear the salvation message from Jesus himself, but he heard it from the apostles, right? It was attested to us. So he puts himself in the category of people who heard from the apostles, not the category of speaking as an apostle. The same is true of Hebrews 2:1. So this guy is probably not an apostle, which would take away Paul as a possible author. Some Christians still think Paul wrote it. However, that could be an evidence against Paul's authorship. Number four, when it comes to the author, number four, though we can know some things about him, that he was a he, we knew his recipients well, friends with Timothy, highly educated, probably not an apostle, though we have some ideas, we actually, here's the final thing we'll say about the author, we just don't know. I like what Origen, early church teacher, said this, who actually wrote this epistle? Only God knows. So we can speculate, but when it comes down to saying definitively, we have no idea who wrote the book of Hebrews, but I'm so glad it was written. So that's who wrote it. When was it written? We are in this class going to give the date of 70 AD. 70 AD, and the reason for that are these three reasons. Number one, Timothy is mentioned as alive, so that puts it before the death of Timothy. Before the death of Timothy. Number two is Hebrews highly influenced a letter called First Clement, which was written in 96 AD, First Clement written in 96 AD. And so First Clement quotes extensively from Hebrews. It's a theology and thoughts about God. Language about God it alludes to Hebrews often, which tells us that Hebrews, at least in 96 AD, was written. It was well known, and it had been processed by Clement pretty deeply. And so that makes it probably a good amount of years before 96 AD. And then lastly, the temple is spoken of as still standing. We know that the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. In the book of Hebrews, the imagery of the temple and the priesthood is utilized often, because as you'll see, one of the purposes of Hebrews is to protect Jewish Christians from going back to Judaism, from leaving Jesus and going back just to mere Moses. And his argument is, don't leave the reality for the picture. Jesus is the reality. The Old Testament is just a picture of him. Don't leave the band for the flyer that the band is going to play. He's saying, don't leave the reality for the thing that points to it. And so if he was making this argument, when he spoke about the temple, if the temple had been destroyed already, it'd be an easy argument for him to make, is why go back to the temple, to the sacrificial system, to the priesthood? The temple's not even standing anymore. It's not even standing. But he never does that. He speaks about the temple as if though it's still standing when he's writing, which is, I think, strong evidence that this letter was written prior to the temple being destroyed. So the ESV Study Bible, pause the video, go ahead and read that quote there. It explains that last point well. All right, moving forward. C, who was it written to? Real simply, it's written to Christians who were Jewish Christians. So people who were Jews by race and formerly by religion, by faith, and then they had heard about Jesus and they had trusted in Jesus as the Messiah. They were transferred from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, from Moses to Christ. And here's two things we know about these Jewish Christians that are being written to. Number one, they were Jewish Christians who were suffering intensely. Pause the video, read Hebrews 10, and you'll see the suffering that's alluded to. So they were suffering people. Number two, these were Jewish Christians who were being tempted to abandon Jesus and return to Christless Judaism. They were tempted to abandon Jesus and return to Christless Judaism. It's one thing to say, I believe in Jesus, but when you start getting persecuted for it, made fun of, in this case, actually attacked, physically attacked, materially persecuted, money taken away, people thrown into jail, seeing people actually being beaten, imprisoned for following Christ, then you start to really question, is it worth following Jesus? Maybe some of you guys, you're Christians and you're in high school and people make fun of you because you don't participate in some of the sinful things that other students do. You stay away from getting drunk. You stay away from getting high. You stay away from sex outside of marriage because you know that's not how your Lord designed sex to be enjoyed. You stay away from the idolatry of a lot of other high schoolers, and they look at you and they don't say, "Oh, you're such a great example to us." They don't say, "Wow, you're so cool." They say, "Man, you're kind of a bummer to hang around. Man, you don't do anything fun like we do. You're kind of a wet blanket." They'll make fun of you for the way that you live. And that's a form of persecution, albeit you're not having your head chopped off or being threatened to be thrown into prison. But when you are persecuted, when you are made fun of, when you are attacked, when you are belittled, when you are ostracized for following Jesus, that's when you really have to go, is Jesus worth it? Is he worth it? And a lot of the people that the author of Hebrews was writing to, is they were questioning, man, ever since I became a Christian, life has been terribly hard. Is Jesus worth it? Because when I was just a Jew, I had a synagogue and a family. I had these holidays, and my family didn't reject me. My community didn't reject me. My government didn't attack me. Life was nice. It was easy. It was comfortable. Should I leave Jesus and go back to that? It's a question they weren't asking alone. It was a question that all of us are asking whenever we face any kind of form of suffering, however big or small, for Jesus. So these were people who are being tempted to leave Jesus and go back to empty Judaism. Why do we think it's written to Jewish Christians. Here's a couple quick notes. Number one, his way of addressing the readers. He talks about God speaking to our fathers by the prophets. And so the fact that he says our fathers and he mentions the prophets, he's probably not speaking to Gentiles exclusively because their fathers weren't spoken to by the prophets. That's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So that's one reason. Number two, he uses the Old Testament heavily, super heavily, which again tells us he assumes his readers are informed by it. Number three, his warnings not to leave Jesus for the Old Testament people, rituals, and sacrifices. So one of the main temptations that he is arguing against is he's telling people, don't leave Jesus and go to the temple, to the priesthood, to the Old Testament rituals. If he was writing to Gentiles, that's not what they would be tempted to go back to. They'd be tempted to go back to the Roman gods. They'd be tempted to go back to pagan rituals. So the fact that he's encouraging, he's exhorting, he's warning his readers not to go back to empty Judaism, again, tells us that they're probably Jews. So take a moment, pause the video, read these two passages that follow, point 3 there, just so you can see the flavor of these warnings to not go back to empty Judaism. Okay, D, we're doing good here. Why was it written? A couple reasons, two specifically. One, it was written as a warning to warn against leaving Christ. Think of Hebrews like a big sign near the edge of a cliff, and it says, do not go any further, turn around. The recipients of this letter, again, were tempted to leave Jesus and go back to merely Moses. And the author of Hebrews is flashing the red lights. He's hitting the sirens. He's putting the sign up in the ground. He has his megaphone out and he says, don't go any further, because if you do, there's only a cliff in front of you. You see, the author of Hebrews is a good friend and he's a good pastor. He doesn't just tell people what they want to hear, he tells people what they need to hear. He knows his people are tempted to leave Christ, and he knows leaving Christ is leaving joy, it's leaving salvation, it's leaving hope itself. And so he's being a good friend and a good pastor. He's not just saying things they want to hear, he's saying things they need to hear. He is warning them. So pause the video, read these two paragraphs, and you'll see the flavor of his warnings. They're pretty intense. They're not just, hey, I really encourage you not to do what you're doing. They are very explicit, very intense. Read those for a moment. That leads us to point 2. He doesn't just warn them of leaving Christ. He wants to encourage greater loving of Christ. You see, it's one thing just to say, don't do this, but it's another thing to say, hey, run after this, pursue this. So he's not just giving them a bunch of no's, he's actually giving them no's in order to make room for his one big yes. So he says, he writes to encourage greater loving of Christ. And you'll see, even by the amount of passages we have here, his encouragement to look to Jesus, to see how that Jesus is better, Jesus is greater, Jesus is more satisfying, he's more glorious than the Old Testament prophets, priests, kings. Look at these paragraphs where he just emphasizes the goodness of Jesus and how if we have Christ, we need nothing else. All right, and that then leads us to how is this book written? And hopefully you'll see, again, this message about arguing that Jesus is better. Oh, my daughter Penny wants to say hi. You want to say hi? Oh, you silly girl. Okay. Here's what he says, or here's how the book is structured. First, we have the introduction in 1 through 3, and then we get into his one of the main arguments, which is Jesus is better. This is point 2. Jesus is better. Is Jesus better? Is Jesus better? You silly girl. What is he better than? Here's what we see. He's better than the angels. That's 2:1. Better than the angels. He is better, number 2, than Moses. Moses was a big deal to the Jews. I brought him the law. He says Moses was a servant in God's house. Jesus is the son in God's house. At your house, you may have a gardener. Your gardener may be loved and respected, enjoyed. You may have a good relationship with your gardener, but your gardener does not have the same status as you, hopefully, in your house, right? It's different to have a servant, a worker in the house, than it is to have a child. And so Jesus is a family member in God's house, or he is actually, sorry, I should say the son of God, not just a servant of God. 3, Jesus is better than the high priests, all the old high priests of the Old Testament, better than Aaron, better than all these Old Testament high priests. And then 4, Jesus is better than the sacrifices of the Old Testament. The Old Testament sacrifices of the lambs and the goats that were given on the Day of Atonement. Hold on, Daddy's teaching. I just got a couple more points here. So he's better than the sacrifices. All the Old Testament sacrifices, as we'll see later on in this lecture, had to be offered again and again, day after day, and they could never take away sins. Jesus offered one sacrifice for all time that perfectly took away all sins. Hold on.
Got a passage.
I did, yeah. All right. So that's the first, that's from chapter 1 to chapter 10. Jesus is better. When you think about Hebrews, think Jesus is better. Can you say that with me? Say, Jesus is better. Ready? Ready? Here we go. Jesus is better. Ah! All right. And so because he lays down this truth that Jesus is better, he then gives these exhortations. Number 3, hold fast to Jesus. If there's nothing and no one better than Jesus, then what you need to make sure your life consists of is this. Get your hands around Jesus and hold on as tightly as you can, because he alone is what will save you and satisfy you. Think about it like this. Jesus is the only rope that has been thrown down to those who are falling off a mountain. And so when this is the only rope that you have, what you do is you grab onto that until your knuckles turn white, right? Until your bones ache. But your whole purpose in life is in that moment is to hold on to that one rope, because if you let go of that one rope, you will fall down the mountain. The author of Hebrews is saying there's all these other ropes that are given to you. Forsake all of those other ropes and hold on to this one rope because of Jesus, because all those other ropes are not actually anchored to anything. If you grab onto them, you'll fall. But Jesus is our one sure, steady, anchored rope. And so because he's better than Moses, better than the angels, better than anything else you could ever chase after, grab him and hold fast to him. Hold fast to him. Chapter 11, live by faith in Jesus like the Old Testament saints did. Number 2, trust God's fatherly discipline through trials. See, just because you're holding fast to Jesus doesn't mean life will be easy or comfortable. God will be your father. As you trust in Jesus, God becomes your father. And good dads don't just keep their kids alive. They grow their kids. They discipline their kids so their kids actually grow up and are strengthened and matured. And so trusting in Jesus won't keep you away from won't keep you away from trials, but trusting in Jesus ensures that trials that come your way are only intended for your good. So it's important so one of the ways we hold fast to Jesus through trials is by knowing that the trials that come to us are God's fatherly discipline, not his punitive just judgment against our sins. It's not to hurt us, but these trials are in God's hands to help us. And then lastly, live to please God through Christ. All right, so there are the nuts and bolts of Hebrews. Remember, to sum it all up, Jesus is better. Now we're going to look at the unique elements that Hebrews offers us. Now that was a lot of nuts and bolts, but just to, again, give you a different way to hear some of the same information, I have the video from the Bible Project here, and I want you to watch this. Don't just listen, but watch it with your eyes. Take notes as you enjoy on your own, but this will be an animated version, just reviewing the content we just went over.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the Promised Land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this: Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily, but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.